I'm glad to welcome Robin and Roxanne, and they will be presenting Stepping into the Void, Strategies for Managing the Unmanaged. Before we get started, let's go over a few logistical items. The session, as you have heard, is being recorded. Captions are available during this session by clicking on the live button at the bottom of your Zoom window. Thank you to Abby Estes for providing these. Please use the Q&A feature for any presentation questions. You can choose to do this anonymously. There will be 10 to 15 minutes for the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Please use the chat for general comments or technical issues. Nicole Thomas will be monitoring the chat for any questions and comments. Nicole Thomas will also be adding some links to the chat. One is for collaborative resource sharing. If you think of a related reading, podcast, video, or something else, please share it with us in Column's recommended resources document or in the chat. Due to Google Doc limitations, we ask that you close out of the document after you have added a resource. One of our volunteers will drop this information in the chat. The next link is our code of conduct. And now I will turn things over to our presenters.
Hello. Thanks for coming to our presentation, Stepping into the Void, Strategies for Managing the Unmanaged. I'm Robin Miller, and my pronouns are she, her.
I'm Roxanne Backowski, and my pronouns are she, her. We Wisconsin Eau Claire, where we both manage library units and contribute to our library's public services, information literacy instruction program, and library technical services. Before we begin, we would like to note that this session is being recorded, and the recording will be posted on the YouTube Calm conference channel.
We would like to acknowledge that here in Eau Claire, we reside and work on traditional Ho-Chunk and Ojibwe homeland east of the Mississippi River and southwest of the Great Lakes, where the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. I really appreciate the Electa Quinney Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, which offers guidance about crafting acknowledgements that both begin with facts and reflect communal experience.
Over the course of our discussion today, we're going to talk about characteristics of unmanaged situations, and we'll briefly offer 3 cases that we have encountered in our work. These cases cannot possibly represent all unmanaged situations, so we welcome your comments and anecdotes about unmanaged experiences as well. Another reminder, this session is being recorded, so if you do contribute an anecdote, please be mindful of the confidentiality in the details you disclose. Case study, we will share our strategies for bringing management to a situation. Chat, we hope you will share how you would address a situation. And finally, we'll discuss timing and opportunities for making change.
So, what is an unmanaged situation? So on the screen here, we have listed some characteristics of unmanaged situations that Roxanne and I have encountered in the workplace. If you have observed or addressed an unmanaged situation in your current or past work, please do go ahead and describe its characteristics in the chat. We listed 5 characteristics here that we view as some qualities of unmanaged situations. In our experience, unmanaged situations don't necessarily have all of these characteristics at once, but they all, in our experience, seem to have at least one of them. I also want to begin by acknowledging that unmanaged is a really subjective term. So when Roxanne and I first started talking about our experiences with what we began to call unmanaged situations, it took a while for us to even define it for ourselves. In the field of organizational studies, there's an influential article by Giannis Gabriel called The Unmanaged Organization. We'll include the citation in the reference list at the end, and I will also add it to the shared resources document. So Gabriel suggests that all organizations have what he calls an unmanaged terrain. And in that unmanaged terrain, employees engage in spontaneous behavior that is unsupervised. Gabriel is not suggesting that all of this behavior is negative. And he's also trying to normalize the idea that not everything can be managed. So spontaneous behavior may be as simple as a spontaneous conversation with the coworker in the hallway. It could also be a quick check-in with someone to run an idea past them, or it could be an on-the-fly problem-solving situation. There are lots of ways that we engage in spontaneity at work. It's a spectrum. And managers, of course, have to make a distinction between the spontaneous events that they need to intervene in versus not. In my opinion, especially in a service-oriented organization like a library, spontaneity can be really helpful in solving problems or meeting a patron's needs in a just-in-time way. But it's certainly also a way easy to imagine how a practice that begins spontaneously could become unmanaged, either quickly or over time. So in the business literature, the phrase unmanaged isn't really a very big part of the discourse in my observation. But I do see quite a bit of discussion about the difference between projects that are formally managed and projects that are informally managed. The implication here is also not that informally managed projects are bad, but that people who research project management often use phrases like distributed work or flexible project control when they're talking about informality. This really spoke to me because my experience with libraries is that we are very distributed organizations by necessity. And that distribution helps us to keep the building open and to keep our services active. There are lots of reference points for what I think of as unmanaged situations in the workplace, in pop culture. And if you can think of any, please do add them to the chat. But two that stand out for me are the TV shows Silicon Valley and Mythic Quest. Both of these have many unmanaged scenarios in the workplace, and often with very hilarious results. Those shows, of course, are fiction, but Uber is portrayed in the film Super Pumped. It's a dramatized example of a startup that grew very rapidly and notoriously, and with little attention to its management of human resources. Over time, as we know, Uber was weighed down by ethical and operational problems. I certainly don't mean to pick on the tech sector in this presentation, but within the IT sector specifically, there's this phrase, shadow IT, which can refer to software or hardware or some IT process that's created without the awareness of an IT organization. So this phrase really raises my hackles personally, because I do not like having to ask my campus IT organization if I can try a simple piece of software. I find that to be unnecessarily bureaucratic, and I imagine many of you do as well. But within the IT field, shadow IT is a problem because it creates unmanageable situations. So I bring this up only to sort of surface that there is a tomato kind of flavor to the unmanaged situation. The strategies for managing the unmanaged that Roxanne and I will discuss today really do just come from our own subjective experience. But that being said, in talking about unmanaged things with our coworkers and colleagues outside of our library, I think we have both had the experience of a sense of familiarity. And I suspect that many of you are here today because the idea of something that is unmanaged does feel really familiar, even if it's kind of hard to wrap our arms around. So in our experience, a manager may encounter a situation that has the veneer of management, but when they look under the hood, they may see some or all of the traits listed on the screen here. So in an unmanaged situation, there may be a person or a group that it is not empowered to make decisions, whether they're large or small decisions. There may be a long-standing and unexamined process involved. It may also be something that began on the fly to fulfill a specific need, but then it became an institutionalized practice over time. So an example from our library, we used to have this small and very popular circulating collection, but it had to be checked out using a tiny piece of paper that was kept in a drawer that was often locked. So that is an example of something that just initially began because we just needed to figure out really quickly, but then it became a confusing process that was difficult to communicate to colleagues. Unmanaged situations may also be the third rail of workplace conversation. And unmanaged situations often affect more than one person, and likely in a library, they affect either a whole unit or an organization. And so they can not only affect people internal to the organization, but also to users, or customers, or patrons, or whatever you want to call the people who avail themselves of their services. So while everyone has likely worked with someone who spreads chaos wherever they go, unmanaged situations also really are not a single person's responsibility. At the end of our talk, we will discuss briefly personnel changes. And I certainly want to acknowledge that individual performance or a small group's performance may be implicated in an unmanaged situation, and there may be a variety of personnel strategies to use to address that situation. But unmanaged situations are not really just about a person, they're about an organization. And whether that's an organization of 3 people or a very large unit or multiple units distributed across an organization, unmanaged problems tend to, they don't just involve people, they can also involve procedures or policies, processes, products, depending on the industry you're in. But I think it's really important to sort of accept that they're not, the solution to an unmanaged problem typically is not going to be just moving someone to another position or termination or something like that. So it would be great to hear in the chat if you have observed an unmanaged situation with any of these characteristics here, or certainly if you've observed unmanaged situations that have other shared characteristics that we haven't mentioned. Veronica, I love Mythic Quest too. I think it's very funny. So thanks for making some additions to the list, and for talking a little bit about your own experiences. So Andrew mentions managers letting things slide due to a legacy policy that doesn't make much sense anymore. That has absolutely been a kind of unmanaged situation that we have observed repeatedly. And certainly systems like LibGuides, I think, are a great example of a system that can be really tough to maintain management over, and that's something that we have also tackled in our library. So there are so many examples. So as you are thinking about the case studies that we share here, we certainly encourage you to share your own experiences in the chat to the extent that you're able to do that. So our first case study is about our library's discovery layer. So our library, like most of yours, has a discovery layer. In our case, we use Primo, but the brand is not actually important here. So the discovery layer is critical infrastructure. So it's our user's primary tool for locating library resources. It's on the front page of our library website. It's where it plays a central role in our information literacy instruction practice and our frontline user services. In our library, discovery became unmanaged for a few reasons. So first, no responsibility was assigned to a single person or group to manage it. Second, there was no real agreement on essential work. And there was no one person who had the agency to do the essential work or to delegate it, for that matter. So how did this happen? For a long time after implementation of our discovery layer, many of our colleagues were pretty dissatisfied with the way it worked. They found it to be unreliable, difficult to use, really tough to teach with, lots of broken links, problems like that. We also had a personnel change early on, and that was a real missed opportunity for us to have some good conversations about the discovery layer and how we could resolve some of those dissatisfactions at that point. But hindsight is 2020. So for several years, one library employee in systems was keeping our discovery layer up and running, but that person had very limited power to develop the tool or to make enhancements. So they didn't see the problems experienced by library users either, because they weren't in a public service or teaching role. So that person was operating in a very isolated silo. In another silo, there was a group of people with growing dissatisfaction about the service. And they weren't empowered to develop or enhance the tool either. So that was another silo. And these two groups of people, these two silos, did not have a forum at all for discussion of the problems. And if you're hearing this now and you're thinking, wow, how dysfunctional, we agree. But that's where we were. So many libraries function for a long time in a sort of doing the best we can with what we have mindset. And in this case study, I think that mindset was a force for maintaining the status quo. And it was also a very strong excuse for just maintaining standard operating procedures without any examination. So how did we address this? So we made the change by turning library discovery into a project. I was just listening to a great lightning talk in the previous session about the problems with project management. And I want to say that Roxanne and I are not project managers. That is not part of our job descriptions. We have never engaged in any kind of project management training, although we've done a fair amount of reading here and there. We've no background in Agile or anything like that. I'm super interested in project management and how it could be applied in libraries, but I was really fascinated by the discussions of project management in the lightning talk earlier, and I would encourage people to go back and listen to those recordings if you have a chance. Thinking about project management and some of the sort of intuitive elements of project management, we have noticed a number of qualities of project management that seem to be easy to kind of pick up on and incorporate into our management work. One of these is identifying stakeholders. And so we knew that we had a large group of people who were dissatisfied with the discovery layer. And again, we hadn't previously had much of a forum for discussing it. So we had to bring together the stakeholders and begin those conversations. Last November, there was a really interesting article in the Harvard Business Review called "The Project Economy Has Arrived." And we will include the citation in our references at the end and in the resource document. But the author's key argument in that article was that projects displace operations. And so the author's point was that from their perspective that work is continuously developing and changing, and while standard operating procedures are static and unexamined, projects represent adaptation and evolution. So this article really spoke to me because I feel like the discovery layer project that we began has really just become a project in phase after phase after phase after phase. That might not be good project management now that I've attended the lightning talks earlier, but in identifying stakeholders and then looking for the meaning of the product, in this case, the discovery layer, defining our essential work, and then appointing a product or project owner to take the discovery layer through the many enhancements that we wanted to make, and then to continuously monitor the enhancements, communicate fixes, and move the product forward we felt that we were making a project. I should also note that this became my job. So I moved from a largely information literacy instruction job into being the head of discovery in my library and managing the discovery layer and also the relationships with all of the stakeholders who are engaged in doing the nuts and bolts work, as well as the teaching work and the user services work involved with the tool. To make this happen, we had to have many long conversations, and some of them, to be quite honest, were really difficult. And this whole process it created a lot of tension and disagreement within our organization. So I also want to make the point that moving from an unmanaged situation like our discovery layer in this case might be a very long-term commitment to conversation and reallocation of work. But in our library, once we arrived at the point where we agreed on the meaning of the discovery layer, we reached a point where we agreed on the critical issues associated with the tool, and we had to accept some vulnerability there, that we simply had not been attending to this thing that we actually valued a lot and that we really wanted to develop and enhance for the sake of our users. So the example of the discovery layers represents a very long-term commitment to bringing management to something that has had for a long time not been managed. But in thinking of it as an ongoing project, we were able to bring it into a forum where we could talk about it. We could and we could agree to move the product forward. And now I'm going to turn it over to Roxanne, who is going to talk about our next two cases.
Thanks, Robin. So this is our second case study. An unmanaged situation is not necessarily a long-standing unexamined practice. We mentioned that in our characteristics that unmanaged situations could have a legacy practice, but on the flip side, it also might not be a legacy practice. Libraries often implement new products, tools, and services. So in this case study, I had some enterprising staff who identified a new service that the library could provide, and capitalizing on strong working relationships, they worked together to sort out the technical details of a chapter scanning service and then announced it to all staff. The situation was unmanaged for a couple reasons. First, there is no preliminary discussion about whether the service was aligned with the library's existing priorities. Second, the staffing implications of the service had not been evaluated and several assumptions were made. There was a rush to implement this idea because of the academic calendar. We're not sure if all libraries have this problem or have noticed this. Please do shout out in the chat if you do. It would make us feel a little less lonely. But we're not sure if you notice this, but it often seems that we either delay or accelerate decision-making based on the semester or seasons. And sometimes this is important because of instruction, but other times it's really not required. It's an artificial structure that we're putting in place for ourselves. So, and I'm seeing in the chat, a couple other people are saying, yep, 100%. So I'm heartened and comforted by that. That kind of happened in this case. It was announced before the beginning of the semester, was said to go live within 2 weeks. And yeah, so there's a rush to go live. I also want to point out, after kind of laying the groundwork for this case study, that we want to be clear that we don't object to spontaneity or innovation, but most libraries are not one-person organizations. Unmanaged spontaneity may be enterprising employees with a lot of initiative, but not necessarily all the facts, taking on a project that becomes unmanaged. So Now that I've described this case, I'm going to turn it all over to you and open up for comments. Tell us what you would do in this situation in the chat.
Spoiler alert, nobody got fired in this situation at all.
Yeah, review actual need. Yep. See if turnaround for project completion is manageable. Seek buy-in. Ask the group who should be responsible for it. Make sure ILL, document delivery, are involved. So gathering stakeholders. Well, I'll let you continue to share some strategies how you would attempt to address this. Or coming in now as I'm speaking, designated a period of time to test run it. We did think about that as a pilot, how it would be evaluated and assessed. Unavoidable. One. The strategy we took in this situation, we I guess kind of put together and said we're gonna attempt to be novices, and being a novice as a manager requires us to take a position of vulnerability and admit I don't know, or I'm not the expert here. We recognize this approach might be perceived by some as minimizing one's authority, and we admit it's a temporary but significant time commitment. There are a couple of different ways to be a novice. A couple of them were mentioned. The first one, through purposeful information gathering, going straight to the source, which means talking with the employees who do the work, getting interlibrary loan involved, and talking to those who use the product or service. This could also be consulting with your professional network. I see reaching out to university legal, and reading documentation. One thing that Robin did in the discovery layer case was to read as much about the documentation about Primo as a discovery layer to be informed about what could happen. That information gathering can be seeking outside expertise. So it could be library consortia system support, colleagues at other libraries, outside departments, maybe even outside the library profession, and even listservs could be useful. In our case, asking the consortia systems support prompted an invitation for me to attend a demonstration. The demo was scheduled for another institution looking at the same chapter scanning functionality. And I was able to attend that demonstration and ask questions as if it was my first time encountering the tool. And then I had people to reach out to at another campus and some context to rely on for future questions. Another way to be a novice, cross-training is an effective way of learning and understanding the possibilities for change. Cross-training can take the form of a subject matter expert communicating core competencies and procedures to people with adjacent work. This can be very effective when you're in the information gathering stage. It sort of changes the power dynamic too. Rather than starting with, we have a problem and I want to fix it, cross-training can help you understand the problem and potentially facilitate a collaborative path forward. And then another strategy within being a novice is testing. Doing user testing, analyzing internal workflows, or testing software functionality is an additional way to be a novice. Whatever type of testing you do, the goal is to engage all stakeholders and work towards answering basic questions like, does this even work? And What are the complications? Respond to after the chapter functionality service was announced at all staff was the form that needed to be built in our discovery layer to request chapters to be scanned. The review of the form brought the opportunity to state preferences and desires for the user experience, and also learn what limitations the back-end system brings. Another benefit of testing is the opportunity to model program or product development. For those not familiar with testing or project management skills, it can be a learning experience. For example, how to create scenarios, control outcomes, and tweak the test for the next time around based on what you learn, all is part of that learning curve. The strategy of being a novice can bring stakeholders to a shared understanding of what is intended or envisioned. In our case, it turns out that the technical setup of scanning chapters would lay the groundwork for engaging in controlled digital lending among consortia libraries. And that really, once we learned that, that really changed our perspective on this and gave us different reasoning for thinking about the capacity and how this aligned with our strategic priorities. Right, so moving on to our third and final case study. This one revolves around ebook procurement. Purchasing individual ebook titles, the legacy practices of purchasing print materials was applied. This situation was unmanaged because the workflow began informally. It was unexamined, it was complex, it was with an old homegrown system. And then there was a growing volume of work. We started purchasing ebooks before the pandemic, but the start of the pandemic exacerbated that and contributed to that growing volume. There is also some low buy-in from some of the main stakeholders, some sort of philosophical questions of is purchasing ebooks even a route we want to take? And then there was also a division of responsibilities between managers that was unclear. And then there is also the situation with an elephant in the room. Eventually, this person departed, and at that point, we were more free to start managing the process. Now that you've heard this case study about ebook procurement, I'm curious, what would you do? Please add your comments in the chat, and then we'll share how we approach this situation. Yeah, yes, in the chat. And I wonder if that's in relation to the sort of philosophical arguments that we had about should we even be purchasing ebooks? Always assess need, policies, procedures. I'll note that this wasn't our first foray into ebooks. It was just the single title purchasing that is what I was referring to here, and sort of the situation in question. Yeah, brainstorm potential long-term implications. Patron surveys, responses is a factor. A reading group of literature, why purchasing ebooks for academic libraries is the standard. Yeah. As soon as I say something to move on, there's going to be a whole bunch more chats, right? Reaching out to other library consortia to see what they do. That's a strategy I often employ, especially when I was new. I relied on my counterparts quite a bit. Yeah, licensing, peer pressure. Interesting. Say more about peer pressure. everyone for sharing all these practical approaches. I really appreciate those of you who are sharing in the chat. There are multiple ways to address these situations and bring management to an unmanaged situation. And I think the active chat kind of really illustrates how we can rely on our colleagues for support in managerial positions. Here's the strategy we took with our ebook procurement scenario. At our institution, our IT department offers a service that they call process improvement consulting. I had a professional trained in process improvement, and that person brought together a group of stakeholders. This was on Zoom in the summer of 2020. And the consultant used a set of guiding questions to help each stakeholder describe their role in the process. This probably sounds arduous. It was. There were several meetings, lots of question and answer, lots of clarifying questions and answering. And this person was not familiar with ebook procurement at all. But through the series of meetings that we did have, the consultant mapped out all of the steps of the ebook procurement, open questions, problems, and then the library staff received action items, which ultimately led to the revising and streamlining of the process. Duplication of effort was reduced, ultimately with our ebook procurement, and the process was transparent, efficient, and appreciated. I'll just say the library director was one of the people that was part of our process improvement, and the library director appreciated knowing some of the day-to-day work of our technical services staff and how complex some of the work that we do in technical services is. I'll also mention that the nice thing about having an outside facilitator, and I mean outside of, this person worked outside of the library, was the questions were posed in a different way, and there wasn't any threat or pressure for the people answering them. So that really, I think, contributed to the dynamics in the experience. Experiences today, you may have thought, or you might be thinking right now, who has the time for all of this gathering and talking? And to be honest, we wonder this too, and I just wondered this morning. Making time for lengthy negotiations, articulation of processes, and redefining visions is really hard. It's a lot of work. It takes a lot of energy. However, we have found some right times for introducing management, and I'll turn it over to Robin to share those.
Thanks, Roxanne. And for the two people who've entered questions in the Q&A, I see those questions, and I'm going to try to address them in the next couple of minutes, but we will also discuss them further at the end. So we have observed 3 key times when we've been able to bring management into an unmanaged situation. If you have observed another time or had some experience with this, please do share that in the chat, because we certainly don't think that we're limited to these 3 particular right times. Earlier, we mentioned personnel changes. So personnel changes can be good, and personnel changes can be really hard for any workplace, right? And as I mentioned at the beginning, when I was talking about what an unmanaged situation is, I really wanted to emphasize that unmanaged situations are not necessarily, and probably are never, one single person's responsibility. They're when you're in an organization with more than one employee, you're in an organization. You have a lot of interrelated work, and that is very true in libraries, which may be a reason that these situations crop up on what I feel like is a very regular basis. So personnel changes are not necessarily a person's exit from the organization. A personnel change could also be a rethinking of their role, or a change to position description, or something like that. And so that's one way to think about it. But we don't have to think about just blowing everything up on a personnel on the personnel side in order to think about personnel changes as a catalyst for change. So in the case of managing our library's discovery layer, one personnel change that really helped us to reach an inflection point was when we hired a new librarian. And by new, I mean a person who was new to our organization. And so when she joined our organization, she was tasked with developing new digital learning objects. And the struggles that we had had for years with our discovery layer really came to the fore there, because it's so hard to teach people how to use a frustrating tool, especially in a asynchronous format. So having her new voice and the different questions that she asked and a different purpose behind her questions really opened the door for us to begin the conversations. So strategic planning is kind of, yes, we should all have strategic plans, and most of our libraries probably do, and some of our libraries probably even follow our strategic plans. Strategic plans can be a useful reference point to help anyone in the organization understand how work aligns. That's a reference point that could certainly be used if you needed to have something to start a conversation about. Sort of the opposite of strategic planning, though, is the crisitunity. So this is a term that we use here in our organization, and it is definitely not something that you want to happen all the time. The Urban Dictionary says a crisitunity is a situation when a crisis and an opportunity and the people involved come together to solve problems. So COVID was probably a crisitunity across the entire higher ed sector. Drilling down to libraries, the unexpected outcome of a, say, RFP, or a dramatic change in a product that your library uses, or a piece of software or something like that. Those could be moments where you have to really rethink how a situation is managed. And then a change in an institutional policy, not necessarily something that's even within your control. A great example that Roxanne had to deal with several years ago was a change to our university's policies about digital media storage, which really helped us to rethink our approach to acquiring streaming video. In the chat, I see William said a crisitunity is basically every day in public services. And I agree. I think that there are so many opportunities in interacting with the public. And certainly for those of us who've had a lot of information literacy instruction training, or just time in the classroom in general, there are so many opportunities in working with the public and in teaching that that also may seem like crises, whether it's a crisis of understanding and comprehension, or a group activity that just completely falls apart. There are so many times when we as librarians experience crisitunities. On an organizational or managerial level, a crisitunity, I think, can be a great opportunity to bring together a group of stakeholders. So in the example that Roxanne shared about procurement of ebooks, that may seem like a really mundane example, and it is mundane. But the process improvement meetings that we had to rethink and also just illuminate the process helped us get to a point where we fully understood the process became transparent, and we also eliminated a lot of inefficient and duplicate elements of the process, and it became something that was actually managed and understood. So a couple of different questions have arisen in the Q&A, and I think also in the chat about time. So one person has asked in the Q&A, I know many, myself included, are hesitant to point out unmanaged situations because the automatic response is usually that the person who pointed it out is now in charge of it. And I really hear that, and I identify with it too. I think unmanaged situations are very likely going to crop up across the board in all kinds of workplaces, certainly not just in libraries. For a person who is in a management role and perhaps identifying an unmanaged situation that is within the power of the managed unit to do something about, the strategies that we've talked about here could be applicable. So bringing together the stakeholders within that unit. If the person who is noting the unmanaged situation has the agency to bring together a larger group of stakeholders who might be outside of the unit that they manage, I think there would definitely be a need to have some buy-in up the line from, say, a library director or a dean or whoever one reports to. And so some preliminary conversations are going to be necessary there. In relation to another question, so asking or trying to motivate someone to make a change may also motivate them to carving out time in their schedule to actually like begin to manage something. And that is certainly difficult. I think if it was a situation where you were managing managing a direct report who needed to begin to manage a situation, I've had this experience pretty recently. So talking about performance and the link between the unmanaged situation and a responsible person's performance could certainly be part of it. But then I also think it's worth noting that unmanaged situations just don't ever emerge in a vacuum. And so if an unmanaged situation that you don't feel like you have time to deal with is just really grating on you and your colleagues in your organization, I do think it's worth both saying, or like surfacing the situation, and also drawing some boundaries around whether or not you are going to take some responsibility there. And that is certainly a way to protect yourself and your own time. But I do think that, libraries are not emergency responders. So if you believe that you have a lot of unmanaged situations in your portfolio, as a manager, you also get to decide which ones you're going to tackle, right? So it's you are not responsible for taking on every crisis opportunity or every disconnect within services or procedures at once. And so thinking about the academic calendar as an example, and sort of the seasons when we change things in libraries, I think can be a really helpful way of examining like when I would have the time to do something, or when someone else might have the time, or when we might have the time to have a very long series of conversations and check-ins about an issue to see if we are on the right track with bringing some management to it. So I'm going to turn it over to Roxanne, who is going to wrap us up.
Robin, I'll add, just based on a couple of things you said, and I think this was mentioned in the chat too, considering capacity, sometimes like managers don't always have the choice to decide if they're going to take something on or not. In my case, with the cross training and the chapter functionality, I had to kind of quickly pivot, and it took quite a bit of time to learn about the chapter scanning functionality before I could even start to manage. But it was obvious at the time that I needed to make it a priority. I'd also like to point out that right now, Robin and I are presenting these case studies and strategies, and these are a snapshot. We didn't automatically or automagically come up with these strategies when we were in the midst of these situations. Some of them started years ago, and they've been drawn out over several years. And some of them are still not entirely resolved. So just a sort of word of maybe comfort to you all that these things didn't just pop into our brain and we knew immediately how to act. And sometimes we had to wait for those opportunities or crisis-tunities. We've talked today about problems from our own working experience, and we hope we have given you some space to both share and discover some common experiences. It sounds like live guides or live guides is another one of those. But the practical strategies that we shared today, including making things a project, being a novice, and process improvement, these are things we've employed to manage something that was previously unmanaged. And we also believe these aren't unique to our library. We hope you've gleaned something and that you can apply to an unmanaged situation yourself. Thanks for attending our session today. I believe we have looks like about 7 minutes for questions. I think, is there maybe one or two questions left? Otherwise, please pop those in the chat, and thanks for attending.
So the question, how can you navigate an unmanaged situation that falls under the purview of a manager, but that person lacks the knowledge of or is resistant to making changes? So I think that there are two different things happening there. So a manager who lacks knowledge. So I think it's worth unpacking a little bit. Like, does the manager not understand the issue at hand? So is the manager just like clueless about the like what the actual problem is? If that's the conversation, then I think you have to be really elemental and go way back to the beginning, like why, and really like dig into the nature of the problem. Roxanne's points about cross-training are really essential here. So we didn't emphasize this in the presentation, but I want to say now that when we suggest cross-training for a manager who's trying to learn about a situation, we are absolutely not suggesting that the cross-training is a means of micromanaging. Really, what we are trying to understand, we're trying to do is understand the process and understand the points in the process that are a problem. Maybe it's the fail points or the points where things take a lot of time or a lot of human resources, and then think through those points with the stakeholders involved. So the cross training is not a knowledge building for the sake of just adding a new job at all. But if you have a person who resists gaining that knowledge, then that's a problem that I think has to be discussed pretty clearly. But we have certainly in our library dealt with people who are resistant to changes to manage a situation, and the resistance might be defensiveness. It might be just a commitment to the way it's always been done. It may be a lack of energy. Sometimes there are a lot of other projects happening, and it can be it may be that there's just not enough like energy around making a change to a particular thing that I happen to think of as a problem. And so, remembering that my unmanaged situation is not necessarily Roxanne's unmanaged situation, and vice versa. And timing works into that conversation as well. So a manager who's resistant now may not always be resistant, depending on the circumstances and other factors. Roxanne, did you have anything to add about that?
Not a ton, but I would say it seems to me that two of the questions do sort of ask about like, well, what if it's someone, you see this unmanaged situation and you want to bring it up, but you don't want it to be your responsibility, or you want someone else to take the responsibility. I think we're still struggling with that ourselves, with that approach. It's one thing for us to have control and sort of be able to facilitate change within our units, but when they affect almost everyone in the library, or a really big segment of the library, it can be more difficult to get to action or change. I think going up to some extent and communicating either ideas for change or reasoning why something is problematic, or just sort of like, hey, we've had this task force looking at this new bookshelf for 3 years and nothing's happened, like, can we come up with a plan to move this forward? Or maybe it's like determine that's not even useful for something to look at, but whatever the managed situation is, I think there is some convincing that has to happen. And you kind of slowly have to chip away at that and wait for those opportunities to come up to make change.
Okay, we're pretty much come to the end of our time. So thank you again, Robin and Roxanne, for answering the questions for the great presentation. It was certainly a pleasure to have you with us. Before we close the session, I would like to point out the evaluation survey that is available for you attendees to complete. I'm certain the presenters would very much appreciate your feedback. You can find a link to the evaluation in SCED. It's labeled Feedback Survey and is directly above the section description. Thank you all for attending. We hope you have enjoyed this presentation.